Oyster shells into Charlotte Harbor today to help boost water quality and help our fish and anglers. The shells act as a natural filter to get toxins out of the ecosystem.
It began with something almost impossible to take seriously. Between 2007 and 2024, Florida dumped more than 500,000 tons of discarded oyster shells into the Gulf of Mexico. They were not carefully engineered building materials or part of some futuristic restoration technology. They were leftovers, scraped from restaurant plates, collected from seafood processing plants, piled onto trucks, transferred to barges, and finally tipped overboard near Cedar Key. No one expected those discarded shells to become anything remarkable. To many people, the entire idea sounded irresponsible. Critics condemned it as reckless ocean dumping disguised as environmental restoration. Environmental groups warned that covering the soft Gulf seafloor with mountains of shells would smother the fragile marine life already struggling to survive. Local fishermen, whose families had worked those waters for generations, feared the deposits would bury fishing grounds, alter water currents, and permanently damage an ecosystem that had already endured decades of decline. Even the scientists responsible for the project were far from confident. They hoped the shells might eventually provide some useful habitat, but privately, they prepared themselves for disappointment. Before we go any further, please subscribe to our channel and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Yet beneath the surface of the Gulf, something extraordinary had already begun. On what had once been a lifeless stretch of sandy seafloor, change appeared with astonishing speed. The empty bottom was transforming into a thriving landscape, becoming denser, more diverse, and more biologically active, far faster than any scientific model had predicted. What was emerging wasn't simply another artificial reef. It was a living system that continues expanding even today, and the story of how it happened challenges many of the assumptions scientists once held about the way marine ecosystems recover. The project itself had started with an idea so simple it almost sounded absurd. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission proposed collecting discarded oyster shells from restaurants and seafood processing facilities throughout the state. Instead of allowing those shells to end up in landfills, they would be transported to the coast, loaded onto barges, and deposited into the Gulf of Mexico near Cedar Key. By the end of the program, more than 500,000 tons of shells had been placed on the seafloor. The reaction was immediate. Environmental organizations argued that the project was little more than ocean dumping under a different name. They warned that the shells would blanket the soft, sandy bottom and destroy whatever delicate marine communities remained. Commercial fishermen echoed those concerns, fearing increased sediment, disrupted currents, and the permanent loss of productive fishing grounds that had supported their families for generations. The criticism was neither isolated nor emotional. It came from respected voices with legitimate ecological concerns. Even so, the commission moved forward. Their reasoning was straightforward. The shells were destined for landfills regardless. If there was even a small possibility they could serve as reef substrate and help restore damaged coastal habitat, the experiment deserved a chance. What no one anticipated was the speed of the transformation. Not even the scientists who designed the restoration expected meaningful biological development for several years. Artificial reef projects typically require long periods before marine communities begin establishing themselves. Most researchers assumed this project would follow the same timeline. 18 months after the first shell deposits, monitoring teams returned to inspect the sites. They approached the reefs expecting disappointing results, prepared to document another restoration effort that had failed to live up to expectations. Instead, the The first observations left the research team stunned. Dr. Kiskai, a shellfish habitat specialist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, reportedly stopped speaking in the middle of a team discussion as the survey results became clear. Life had already begun colonizing the shell mounds. Not after 2 or 3 years, as nearly every artificial reef study would have predicted. Within months, marine organisms were settling onto the shells and forming dense biological communities at rates that had virtually no precedent in the scientific literature. The discarded shells were behaving as far more than simple piles of debris resting on the seafloor. They had become biological catalysts, triggering ecological processes that unfolded with remarkable speed. Even the researchers struggled to explain why everything was happening so quickly. The answer, it turned out, could not be seen with the naked eye. To understand the remarkable transformation taking place on the Gulf floor, scientists had to focus on something almost invisible. Hidden across every shell surface, microscopic organisms were quietly laying the foundation for an ecosystem that would eventually reshape the surrounding coastline. What was happening beneath those waters was stranger, faster, and far more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. Long before fish returned, before oysters covered the shells, before the reef began to rise from the seafloor, something much smaller was already at work. The transformation began with organisms no one could see. Within days of the discarded oyster shells settling onto the sandy bottom, microscopic bacteria arrived. They spread across the calcium carbonate surfaces, forming thin biofilms that clung to every curve and crevice of the shells. At first glance, they looked insignificant. But these living films were doing something extraordinary. They were laying the foundation for an entirely new ecosystem. These weren't scattered colonies of bacteria growing by chance. They formed organized biological communities, living infrastructure that would prepare the shells for everything that followed. At the same time, the shells themselves were quietly changing the chemistry of the surrounding water. Oyster shells are made primarily of aragonite, a form of calcium carbonate that dissolves slowly in seawater. As that process unfolded, calcium ions were released into the water, creating tiny alkaline microzones around every shell. Those invisible chemical pockets turned out to be exactly what many calcifying organisms needed. Barnacles found places to attach, tube worms settled, juvenile oysters discovered surfaces where they could anchor themselves and begin growing. The shells were doing far more than providing something solid to cling to. They were actively creating the chemical conditions necessary for their own colonization. Weeks passed, and the microscopic world became more complex. Diatoms and microalgae spread across the bacterial biofilms, forming the first layer of a simple but functioning food web. Those tiny producers attracted microscopic crustaceans and larval mollusks, which arrived to graze on the growing films. Before long, the grazers attracted their own predators. The first juvenile fish appeared. Each new arrival created opportunities for the next. One stage supported another, and another after that, until a self-sustaining ecological chain was quietly assembling itself from nothing more than discarded oyster shells. The remarkable part was that none of it could be seen from the surface. To anyone passing overhead, the seafloor still looked almost unchanged. But beneath the water, an ecosystem was already rebuilding itself. That was something an ordinary sandy seabed could never accomplish. Sand offers almost nothing for marine organisms to attach to. It provides no stable surface, no protective structure, no chemical microenvironments capable of encouraging settlement and growth. For years, much of Florida's Gulf Coast had remained biologically trapped by those limitations. The shells changed the rules completely. By the end of the first 6 months, every deposited shell was coated with layers of biofilm and microalgae. From above, many restoration sites still appeared disappointing. Some observers believed the project had failed. But Dr. Krimsky wasn't judging the reef by appearances. Water samples and sediment cores collected from the sites revealed a completely different story. In less time than many traditional artificial reefs require to show even the first measurable biological response, these shell deposits had already developed a complete microscopic ecosystem. That invisible community was never the final goal. It was the scaffolding that made everything else possible. Without the bacteria, there would have been no biofilms. Without the slow release of calcium from the aragonite shells, there would have been no chemical microzones. Without those biofilms feeding the first microscopic grazers, the food web could never have formed. Without that hidden foundation, there would have been no reef at all. Everything depended on those first invisible pioneers. And once that foundation was complete, something remarkable happened. The true reef builders finally returned. For decades, one simple problem had been silently destroying Florida's oyster reefs. Young oysters cannot settle onto soft sand. Their larvae, known as spat, drift through the currents searching for something hard enough to attach to. In healthy coastal ecosystems, that surface comes from generations of older oysters. Layer upon layer of ancient shells gradually forms massive reef platforms that filter water, reduce shoreline erosion, and provide habitat for an estimated 300 different marine species. But along Florida's Gulf Coast, those natural foundations had largely disappeared. Years of overharvesting, pollution, and coastal development had dismantled reef systems that once stretched across hundreds of square miles. By the early 2000s, billions of oyster larvae were still drifting through the Gulf each spawning season, but most never found a suitable place to settle. No hard surface meant no new oysters. No new oysters meant no new reef. The cycle had broken itself. The discarded shells changed that almost immediately. Each shell pile became a perfect landing site, positioned exactly where Gulf currents naturally carried drifting spat. Instead of searching endlessly across featureless sand, the larvae finally encountered the hard substrate they had evolved to find. Within the first year, University of Florida Marine Lab researcher Dr. Bill Pine documented juvenile oysters attaching to the deposited shells in numbers that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The larvae had found their foundation. They settled, they survived, they began to grow. By the second year, many of those juveniles had matured into reproductive adults. Now they were producing larvae of their own. Those new larvae settled directly onto the growing reef, adding another generation of shells and expanding the structure naturally. What had begun through human restoration no longer depended on human effort. Nature had taken over. The process became self-sustaining. By the third year, monitoring surveys recorded an average of 847 oysters per cubic meter of deposited shell. Just a short distance away, soft bottom areas without hard substrate still supported virtually no oysters at all. Even more remarkable, the reefs were no longer confined to the places where the shells had originally been dumped. As oysters lived and died, they left behind new shells that became attachment sites for the next generation. The reefs expanded upward, layer by layer, while simultaneously spreading outward across the seafloor. They were building themselves. Then came the moment that changed the conversation surrounding the entire project. For years, Charter Captain Mike Lenz had been one of the program's strongest critics. His family had fished those waters for 3 generations, and he believed dumping oyster shells would damage valuable fishing grounds. He spoke publicly against the project and warned that it would do more harm than good. Then, in 2013, everything changed. Standing aboard his boat above one of the restored reef sites, Lenz watched a large school of juvenile redfish gathering around a mound of shells, holding effortlessly in the current as though the reef had always been there. After watching the scene unfold, he quietly admitted something he never expected to say. "I was wrong. I've never seen fish stack up like that in 25 years on this water." His words carried weight far beyond a single opinion. They marked the moment when years of scientific evidence met the first-hand experience of someone who had spent his life on those waters. The restoration was no longer just something scientists could measure. People who knew the Gulf best could see it with their own eyes, and the returning fish were only the beginning. Because once structural complexity appears on an empty seafloor, reef fish do exactly what evolution has taught them to do. They find it. Within just 2 years of the reefs taking hold beneath the waters near Cedar Key, something extraordinary began unfolding. The fish surveys arriving on Dr. Pine's desk looked so unbelievable that her team assumed they had made a mistake. They checked their equipment, reviewed their calculations, and repeated their methodology, convinced the numbers couldn't possibly be right. Yet every new survey confirmed the same astonishing reality. Biomass around the restored reef sites had climbed by more than 340% compared to nearby control areas, while species diversity had surged by 280%. But the greatest surprise was hidden inside the details. These weren't mature fish gathering from neighboring waters to take advantage of a new landmark. They were juveniles, born and surviving in habitat that had never before been capable of supporting them. The reefs were not simply attracting life, they were creating it. The transformation unfolded almost like nature following a script that had been waiting decades to be performed. Redfish were among the first arrivals, slipping into the maze of oyster shells where they could hunt for food while staying hidden from larger predators. Soon after came sheepshead, thriving on the growing colonies of invertebrates coating every hard surface. Flounder settled along the reef edges, blending perfectly into the sandy bottom, while snook returned in numbers that local fishermen hadn't witnessed in years. Even more remarkable was the change in the people who depended on these waters. Mike Lenz, once one of the loudest critics of the project, was no longer standing alone. Charter captains throughout Cedar Key began approaching the very commission they had fought years earlier, formally requesting additional reef sites near their favorite fishing grounds. Hotels welcomed more visitors, bait shops sold more gear, and waterfront restaurants saw measurable increases in revenue, all tied directly to the explosion of marine life surrounding the restored reefs. As each season passed, the ecosystem became richer and more intricate. Octopuses claimed permanent homes within the reef's countless crevices. Sea turtles returned, grazing across flourishing invertebrate communities. Dolphins appeared with growing regularity, hunting methodically along the reef edges where dense schools of fish had become reliable feeding grounds. Every newcomer strengthened another layer of the food web, making the ecosystem increasingly stable, increasingly resilient, and increasingly capable of supporting even more life than before. What made this far more than an impressive recovery was what the scientific data revealed about the source of that success. Dr. Pine's team took great care to separate two concepts that are often confused: fish aggregation and fish production. Artificial reefs built from concrete blocks or sunken ships are well known for gathering fish that already exist in the surrounding area. They simply redistribute a fixed population around a new structure, creating the illusion of abundance without increasing the actual number of fish. The Cedar Key reefs told a completely different story. The dramatic increase was driven primarily by juvenile fish, animals born in those waters that were now surviving to adulthood, because the habitat finally allowed them to do so. These reefs weren't rearranging life, they were generating it. That distinction would fundamentally reshape how Florida's fisheries managers viewed the future of reef restoration. Yet, even the fish were only part of a much larger story. Quietly, almost unnoticed at first, something else was changing beneath the surface. The water itself was beginning to transform in ways that nobody had predicted, and the consequences would stretch far beyond the reefs. Each adult oyster filters between 30 and 50 gallons of seawater every single day. When that ability is multiplied across hundreds of thousands of oysters thriving on the restored reefs, the result becomes almost impossible to comprehend. Entire reef systems were now filtering billions of gallons of Gulf water every day, removing suspended sediment, excess nutrients, harmful bacteria, and agricultural runoff without pumps, without electricity, without maintenance crews, and without fuel. Nature had quietly assembled one of the world's largest water treatment systems using nothing more than discarded oyster shells that had once been scraped off dinner plates and thrown away as waste. The Gulf Coast had struggled for decades with relentless nutrient pollution. Nitrogen and phosphorus flowing from farms and expanding cities poured continuously into coastal waters, fueling harmful algal blooms that clouded the sea, consumed oxygen, suffocated marine life, and periodically caused devastating fish kills. Those blooms had become one of the defining symptoms of a damaged ecosystem, but the restored oyster reefs were attacking the problem where it began. Within only a few years, scientists documented measurable improvements in water clarity around the reef sites. Dissolved oxygen levels increased, nutrient concentrations declined, and the improvements refused to stay confined to the reefs themselves. Like ripples spreading across a pond, cleaner water gradually expanded outward, improving surrounding coastal waters in an ever-growing radius. The clearer water allowed sunlight to penetrate deeper than it had in years, and that single change awakened another forgotten piece of the ecosystem. Seagrass beds, essential nursery habitat for juvenile fish, and an important food source for manatees and sea turtles, depend entirely on sunlight. For years, murky water had prevented them from surviving across large portions of the coastline. Now, as oysters continued cleaning the water, seagrass began reclaiming those abandoned areas. Then, another remarkable feedback loop emerged. The expanding seagrass stabilized the seafloor, reducing sediment stirred into the water. Less suspended sediment made the water even clearer, allowing more sunlight to reach the bottom, encouraging still more seagrass to grow. One self-sustaining cycle had triggered another, spreading ecological benefits throughout the entire coastal system. Researchers later estimated that the filtration provided by the 500,000 tons of oyster shells placed offshore between 2007 and 2024 was worth tens of millions of dollars in ecosystem services. Benefits that would have required massive mechanical infrastructure to reproduce artificially. Yet nature accomplished the same task every day, completely free of charge. News of the success did not remain confined to Florida for long. Alabama established its own shell recycling program by 2015. Mississippi followed. Louisiana launched large-scale reef restoration efforts of its own.